We're turning a little bit of a corner here. We've been going through Ephesians, and Paul has been very theological. He's been making a lot of theological arguments, but then not what we would call practical. Now he gets very practical. He's talking about marriage. Marriage. A very difficult subject to talk about, a very sensitive one to talk about. And this comes in the book of Ephesians. Chapter 5 and chapter 6 are what we refer to theologically as household codes. Codes, they're guidelines. It's Paul saying, this is the way that you ought to live as a household, as a Christian household. And so first he's going to tackle marriage, and then next week we'll look at the relationship between mother and father and children and workers and their bosses. But he wants to look at marriage today, and he wants us to see how being Christian gives us a new perspective on marriage. Now, let's be honest here. All of us in this room if I were to ask you, what does marriage mean? Or how do you live out a good marriage? If we're honest with ourselves, first of all, we probably don't know the answer. But any way that we define the answer of what marriage is comes almost 100% out of our own culture, out of our own cultural background. So the way that you and I understand marriage may be completely different because of the way that you were raised versus the way I was raised, or the culture you came out of, or the culture that I came out of. Let me give you an example here. The traditional view on marriage, the conservative, traditional, old view of marriage is this. You marry the person who's going to benefit you the most. You marry the person who has good status, has a good job, who has good security. You marry somebody in the traditional view based upon how that person will help you, or how that person will support you, or how that person will take care of you. And so marriage in a traditional view is very much about what can that person do for me if I marry them? That's how you choose a spouse. And in the more contemporary, or if you come from a modern worldview, you're going to say something like this. Marriage isn't about marrying somebody just because they have a good job, or they have good status, or they have a good family. Marriage is about marrying somebody who makes you feel good, who makes you feel warm, who you're compatible with, who you have what we call chemistry with. Somebody who you look in their eyes and you fall madly, deeply in love. The contemporary worldview says marry that person. Follow your emotions. Follow your feelings. Now, both the traditional view and the contemporary view seem very, very different. One says marry the person who's got the best job, who's got the most security, who's got the best, can take care of you the best. The other view says no, marry the person who makes you feel the best about yourself. Both of those look so different, yet they're exactly the same. And you know why? Because they both look at marriage as how it can benefit you. How marriage can benefit you, how it can further your interest, or how it makes you feel. And this is not the gospel view of marriage. This is not the view of marriage that Paul wants us to see. He wants to see something different about marriage today that's absolutely radical. And it was radical at the time that he wrote it, and it's probably just as radical as the time that we're reading it now. But what I want us to do, what we have to do, let's do a mental thing, okay? Forget your culture. For the next 30 minutes or so, try to forget where you come from, how you were raised. Try to forget everything you ever knew about marriage. Because if we let our culture speak to the Bible, we'll never let the Bible speak to our culture. So let's put out of your head wherever you came from this morning for the next 30 minutes, and just for a little bit, let the Bible challenge your view about what marriage could look like and what marriage for a Christian family ought to look like. And what I want to do today is look at three things. One, the principle of marriage, the purpose of marriage, and the power for marriage. The principle of marriage, the purpose of it, and then the power. How do you do it? The principle. Let's look first. What is the principle of marriage? There's two, if you look back at verse 22 and 25, there's two verbs that he uses, and they're very, very controversial, again, depending upon what culture you come out of. He says that wives are to submit to their husbands, and husbands are to love. Now, if you are a conservative person, or you come from a conservative traditional culture, especially if you're a husband, you're going to look at the word submit and say, aha, see, I'm the boss. My wife has to do whatever I say because that says submit. You're going to, from that, oh my gosh, so many men have taken that verse and said, well, this just proves that men are better than women. Don't you get it? They're always to submit to us. That would be the most wrong translation. The word here, submit, we'll get to it in a little bit. I just want to touch on it here. It does not at all mean in any way, shape, or form that women are inferior or less than men. He actually says, you notice he says wives and husbands. He doesn't say women and men. He's not making a general statement here. He's talking about in a relationship of a husband and a wife, there's supposed to be mutual submission. He doesn't say women in general. He doesn't say women are worse than men or are weaker than men. That's not at all what he says here. And he even goes so far as to give the metaphor of the body and the head. How stupid would it be for the head to say, hey, body, I'm better than you? And the body to say, wow, head, you are better than me. That's not what he's saying here. He's saying the head and the body, they need each other. They work together. One cannot exist without the other. So he can't be implying inferiority here. He cannot be saying that women are somehow worse or weaker or less than men. But a lot of people who come from a traditional worldview take that word submit and they say, see, that means men are better than women. But on the other hand, people with a contemporary or modern worldview will look at that word submit and they'll get offended, especially a lot of women will be offended by it and say, see, this is why I don't like the Bible. This is why the Bible's outdated. This is why the Bible's old. It's useless. It's not important to me. Please do not do that. Let's look at this first. But I want to look at it in reverse. Before we look at the word submit, let's look at the verb love. Husbands. It says husbands are to love their wives. And it seems obvious. You say, of course, a husband has to love their wife. But this word love is something much deeper than just emotional love. You know, in the Bible, there's 3 types of love that you're probably familiar with. Filial love, which is like brotherly love. Eros, which is more sensual, emotional love. This word that he uses, the verb, it comes from agape love. And agape love, all the time in the Bible that it's used, it's most often used about God towards his people. And it's a way to say agape love is not love that takes, but it's rather love that gives. He's saying here, husbands, you have to have this agape love, and you know what? You have to go so far as Christ did for the church. And what did Christ do? He says, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Think about this. He's saying, husbands, you have to mirror Christ. And what did Jesus do? He died for his bride. He died for his church. He says Christ didn't exert authority. He gave up authority. Christ didn't say, I'm the boss. He said, no, I'm going to die on this cross for you. When Paul's commanding husbands to love, he's saying you have to be, as a husband, radically sacrificial. You have to give up all your preferences for your wife. You have to give up all your desires for your wife. You have to give up all your preferences, all your wishes, all your goals. You sacrifice them as Christ did for the church. Now, this was radical because at the time that Paul's writing this, women, for the most part, were viewed as second-class citizens. Oftentimes, they were property. If you were a Jewish man, you'd wake up in the morning and you'd say, I'm glad I'm not a Gentile. I'm glad I'm not a woman. And there's a third one, which I'm forgetting now. But it was just a common practice. Women were not given this type of status. And yet Paul says, husbands, you have to be willing, able, and ready to die for your wife. Now, what does this mean? It means you have to sacrifice your desires. If you have a husband and wife, you're going to go pick out a car. You're going to go buy a car. The wife wants a blue car. The husband wants a red car. The husband's not allowed to say, hey, honey, I'm the head. I'm the boss. We get the red car today. No, the exact opposite. The husband's got to say, you want the blue car? Okay, we'll get the blue car. I have to die for you. I have to die unto you. Not just in the spiritual sense, but in the real practical sense of the word here. He's saying, Paul says, if you knew how Jesus died for you, that's the love you have to give to your wife. You have to kill your selfish desires. You have to serve her unendingly. You have to give to her even when it hurts you. Now, ladies, that word submit doesn't look so bad now, does it? The word submit is a little easier to swallow when you have a husband who's willing to love you like this. We as the church can submit to Christ because we know Christ loved us this way. Christ said, not my desires, but yours. Not my wishes, but yours. I want the red car, but you're going to get the blue car because that's what you want. And he was willing to do it so far as to die for us. Now we can look at the word submit. quickly. The first principle is husbands are to love their wives sacrificially, unendingly, serving them, dying to them, killing off their own desires for their wives' desires. And he says that wives are to submit. And almost every commentator would say that if you have this type of love in your life, you want to submit to it. You want to melt to this type of love. If your husband loves you this way, submitting is not going to be a bad thing. And I wish I could unpack this word submit. It's actually a word in Greek that's used for the army, for the military. And it's a way to say that's how soldiers submit. And why do soldiers submit? They submit their rights. They submit the time they go to sleep. They submit to the time they wake up in the morning. They submit all their rights and their benefits and their privileges. Why? For the greater good of the collective army, for the unit. That's why he uses this verb. He says, wives, you submit not out of inferiority, not because you're less than men, because you're not. You submit because your husband lavishes this love on you that makes you want to melt and submit to him, to give to him, to respect him. Now, those are the principles, but let's be very careful. I want to be very, 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 very careful. Husbands are to love, wives are to submit, and you notice Paul, he gives the principles, but he doesn't give the particulars. He gives the guidelines, but he doesn't give any specifics for how this works out in a marriage. None of it. He doesn't say anything about how husbands and wives are to live out these principles. And this is the beauty of the Bible. It depends on your marriage. You, if you're not married now, have to think about this for the future. If you are married now, you have to think about this for your current marriage. The way husbands and wives work out their roles is not talked about here at all. So a husband has no right to say, well, I'm going to be the one who works, and you, wife, have to stay home because I'm the head, you're the body. No, to do that would be to ignore Proverbs 31. If you ever want to read a beautiful description about a working mother, read Proverbs 31. A working woman, it's beautiful. Paul's not saying that women should stay home and men should work. He's also not saying that men are responsible for fixing the house and doing all the manly things and women are responsible for doing all the girly things. He doesn't say anything about the details for how this gets worked out. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't say something like wives are to stay home and take care of the children, and husbands are to go work. Because actually, in chapter 6, which we'll see next week, he says it's the mutual responsibility of both parents to care for their child equally. See, the beauty of what Paul does here is he gives us the principle, but he leaves us hanging on how to work it out. And he's basically saying this: it's worked out in your marriage. You have to figure that out with your spouse. I'm giving you the principle, submission and love, but how that works is something you have to talk about with your husband or your wife. Essentially, Paul calls for respect. He wants his wives to respect the husbands, but he wants the husbands to show compassion to their wives. And if wives just submit to their husbands, but they have no respect, you know what happens? They become resentful. 20 years later, they start to say things like, now I want to do something for me. I've submitted to him my whole life. Now I want something for me. And you know what that means? It means they were submitting, but not out of respect. They were submitting because they were beaten into it, probably. They were told, you have to submit. On the other hand, if husbands just rule their wives as their heads, but would do it without compassion, what will happen is they'll become oppressive, rude, and mean people. And they'll drive their wives away from them. And Paul says no. And if you look at verse 21, how this whole thing started off, in verse 21, he says, submit what? To one another. This love and this submission is got to go back and it's got to go forth. And there's got to be no record kept of it. You can never say, do you remember all those times I submitted for you? No, he says, submit out of perfect love. The principles are that wives are to submit, husbands are to just pour out this sacrificial love that just makes the wife want to submit, makes the husband want to submit, and you go back and forth submitting to one another. You look at each other's desires, and you say, you should ask yourself the next question, then what is the purpose of marriage, according to Paul? If the principle is mutual submission, and he gives us no details about how that actually looks in a marriage, what's the purpose? The purpose comes in verse 27. And if you look at verse 27, what he says is that you are to present your spouse the same way Christ is presenting the church, in splendor, without a spot or wrinkle or anything of the kind. Let me translate this for you. Basic English. He says you need to be able to look at your spouse or your future spouse and say, I see the person you're going to be. I see the future glorious person that you're going to be one day, and I want that. I want to be a part of that. You don't look at your spouse and say, you make me feel really good, so let's get married. No, he says, you ought to look at your spouse and say, I want to present you wrinkle, without spot, without blemish. That's what I want to do. That's what I want my job to be for the rest of my life. So that in heaven, I can present you in front of God and say, this is my spouse who I love. My wife and I, we started dating when we were 23, 24, around there, something like that. It was a while back, okay? We were young. And I remember, I asked her, and I'm forgetting now, but I think this was our first date. And she looked at me, our first date. We did not know each other at all. We really didn't know each other. Very first date, we spent about 6 hours on this date, talking and back and forth. We went to dinner, and then we went for coffee, and we're talking. It was one of those long, never-ending dates. And I remember still, she looked at me, and keep in mind, I'm about 23 or 24 at the time, and she says, you're going to be an amazing 28-year-old. You're going to meet an amazing 28-year-old. Now, obviously, then it made me add the question, what happens after 28? Do I just start to go downhill? Well, is that my peak 28? What are you saying here? But what she says here, and my wife knew this concept even before I could read this in Ephesians 5. She knew. She looked at me and said, I see something that you're becoming. Not just who you are now, but I see who you're becoming. You're some glorious self that you are destined to be, and I want to be a part of that. This was long before we decided to get married or even engaged, and yet she saw a vision, and this is what Paul is saying. He's saying, in your spouse, you have to see that vision. You have to be able to look at them and say, you're going to be something glorious. I want to be a part of it. I want to help you get there. Not to change you, not to fix you, not to mold you, but to be a part of the ride. Now, this changes marriage from a duty or an obligation or just a romantic feeling. It changes marriage into an epic. It changes marriage into a story that you're writing with your spouse that's going to end one day when you're in heaven, and God is looking at them radiant and glorious. And the husband's able to say, I worked so that my wife could be dressed and clothed in white and be radiant and beautiful. And the wife's going to be able to look at the husband and says, I worked all my life so that the husband could be free, could be the man he's supposed to be. Now, definitely what this means is, let's pause for 1 second before we get to the last point. This means a couple things. The implications are this. It says wives submit, but not, and it says submit in everything. So you're likely to say that the wife always has to say yes to the husband. No, it doesn't mean that. Because remember, if you're a wife and you're trying to make your husband perfect and spotless, when you see your husband doing something that's destructive or that's dangerous to themselves, you stop it. You say, no, stop doing that, honey. You cannot do that anymore. Why? Because it's bad for you. It's destroying the future glorious person you're supposed to be. And husbands in the same way. It says love your wives, but it doesn't say just give in to every emotion that your wife has. Just give in to every feeling and whim that she has. No, because if you did that, it would be destructive for your marriage, for that other person. If our goal in marriage as a husband or a wife is to present the other person to God spotless and radiant, then we have to resist all those things that person does, which are negative, destructive. We don't say yes to everything. We say no. And we say no, why? Because we say this isn't going to make you beautiful. This is going to make you unbeautiful. This habit that you have, this character trait that you have, whatever it may be, you're going to look at your spouse and say, you have to stop it now because it's making you ugly. It's making you unbeautiful. We have to accept the flaws and weaknesses in our spouse because we love them so dearly, but we also have to resist the bad habits in our spouse because we love them so dearly. The purpose of our marriage is to help spouses become the radiant beings that they're supposed to be. Radiant and glorious. And we only do it by sacrificing everything of our own desires. We give up everything that we think we're entitled to or that we own, and we give it to our spouse. Now, that's the purpose of marriage. What's the power? How do you get the power to do this? I guarantee you, if you're not married now, and you get married, and you're a wife, and you say, okay, I know, Ephesians 5, I'm supposed to submit. Okay, I'm going to submit. And you do that for about 15, 20 years, and you do it without the right motivation, you will become bitter, resentful. You will almost hate your husband for submitting. Yeah, you submitted all those years, but you did so for the wrong reasons. What is the reason that we're to submit? What is the reason that we're to love husbands so sacrificially? It comes in verse 21, the very first one. It says you're supposed to submit to one another. And why, Paul says? Out of reverence for Christ. Now, that English word reverence is way too soft. It's weak. It doesn't communicate what Paul's saying here. The word Paul uses is phobia, which is where we get words like claustrophobia or being afraid of something. He says literally, you are to submit to one another out of utter and sheer fear for Jesus Christ. And if you know the way the word fear is used in the Bible, it's not the fear of like a horror movie where you're scared of the murderer coming after you. No, that's not the biblical fear. Biblical fear is complete awe and complete wonder. It's when people look at God and say, I fear you because you're so majestic, you're so beautiful that I can hardly even look at you. The only way we're ever going to be able to sacrifice our lives, submit to one another as husbands and wives, is if we first know, not just in our head, but in our heart, if we know every day and remind ourselves the immense sacrifice that Christ went through for us. If you're fearful of that, if you're in awe of that, Paul says, you have to be in awe. He says, if you're not in awe of what Christ did for you, you're never going to be able to submit and sacrifice for your husband or for your wife. Christ saw us and sees us in our weaknesses and our flaws, and he still says, I'm going to sacrifice for you. You know, the funny thing is, after you get married, you see your spouse first thing in the morning, and I'm not that good looking right now. Imagine me first thing in the morning. I don't have a suit on. I'm not washed. I'm in my t-shirt, my shorts. My hair's messed up. Everything. I'm ugly in the morning. Most of us are. We're not put together well. And a spouse has the unique ability to see that in the other person. Only a husband sees the wife first thing in the morning before the makeup goes on, before there's a shower, before she looks beautiful. And only the wife sees the husband in the morning before he puts on his suit and looks all confident and respectful. And only Christ sees you and I in the morning. Only Christ, the Lord of the universe, sees us as we really, really are and says, I love you just really, really the way you are. And unless you see the Lord of the universe looking at you and your brokenness and our dirtiness without our makeup on, without looking good and being presented well, unless you see the Lord of the universe looking at us like that and still saying, you are radiant and you are beautiful because of what Christ did for you, we will never be able to sacrifice for someone else. It just won't happen. You're only motivated to sacrifice in as much as you have been sacrificed for. Wives will submit, but they'll keep a record of it. And 15 years later, the wife will say, you know how many times I've submitted for you? And husbands may be loving, kind of, but they'll be unable to show deep compassion. They won't be able to sacrifice. They'll just become bossy men ruling over their wives. Unless we realize that Christ was the ultimate spouse for us. In verse 32, this is what Paul's saying. He says, I'm giving you all these codes and these principles for how to be married. But he says, really all I'm talking about is Jesus. He says, I'm talking about the way Jesus is the perfect spouse for you. Jesus is the only one who will never leave us. Jesus is the only one who submitted perfectly to us. Jesus is the only spouse, and this is why he calls himself the groom. He's the only spouse who will give up his life and did give up his life for us, for the church. We have to see the Lord of the universe doing that. And in verse 26, I wish I could spend more time on this, but we're going to be short on time. Verse 26, he says, you do this in order to make your spouse radiant and splendid. That word is actually transform. And the way that Paul uses it is to say this. Basically, let me summarize. Paul's saying this. Christ looks at the church, and the church has not one thing beautiful in it. He says that Christ has to transform the church, meaning that at the beginning of the process, the church had not one beautiful thing. The church was ugly, needy, desperate. And Christ still says, I don't care how needy you are. I don't care how desperate, how broken, how selfish you are. I will die, and I did die for you. There had to be a price paid. You know the story of Hosea from the book of Hosea. And the book starts off with God basically looking at Hosea, and he says, Hosea, I want you to be my prophet. But in order for you to be my prophet, first, I want you to understand the type of love relationship that I have with Israel, my people. And what does he command Hosea to do? He tells Hosea, go out and marry Gomer, this woman. But he says, Hosea, Gomer will never one day in her life ever be faithful to you. She'll cheat on you. She'll run away with other people. She will embarrass you. She'll mock you. And that's the way that you know how my people treat me as their God. Israel was never faithful to God. Israel constantly went after other gods. And you remember there's a part in the middle of Hosea where Hosea has to go to the middle of the town, surrounded by all of his friends and family, and his wife is being sold. And he has to buy her. He takes his money there and he trades for his own wife, who's in the middle of the city. You know how embarrassing that would be? How disrespectful that would be? And yet God says, Hosea, that's exactly what I have to do for my people. I have to go into the most shameful place on the cross to buy them back. I have to submit to death, the ultimate evil, the ultimate embarrassment, to get my wife, to get my church back. And Paul says, this is what husbands have to do for wives. This is what wives have to do for husbands. It's never ending. It's a constant sacrifice. But you only can do it when and only when you see that Christ went to the most shameful place to buy you back, to get you back. Now, I know this, I can preach on Sundays, but tomorrow's Monday. How does this make any difference in your life starting tomorrow? Very practically, ask some of these questions. If you're married, think about what have you sacrificed for your spouse lately and not kept a record of it? What have you sacrificed for your husband or for your wife and not kept a mental record of it? Husbands, do you assert authority over your wife, or have you relinquished the authority and said, let me serve you? And most importantly, for the people here who aren't married, think about how you choose your spouse. Do you choose your spouse because of what they give you, how they make you feel, what kind of family they come from, what kind of job they have, how comfortable it'll be to marry them? Or do you look at that person and say, I see something beautiful growing inside of you because of what Christ did for you. And just because what Christ did for me, I want to do the same for you. Mutual submission, Paul says. But it's only possible when you see the one who went into the marketplace for you and me. He bought us back at his cost of his own life. Please pray with me. Lord, remind us again and again that you are the God who chases after us. And because you chase after us, Lord, we can chase after our spouse, our husband or wives. Let us all, as men and women here, this is a message applicable to all of us. Either we're married or we're going to be married, and we need to be reminded, Lord, that it's a mutual submission, a giving up of oneself, a dying of oneself for the other person, Lord. Help us to remember that the gospel is the only thing that makes this possible at all. Help remind us, Lord, that the strength to do this can come only from you and you alone. Point us back to the cross, to see you shamed for our glory, to know that you are presenting us with splendor without spot or wrinkle, so that we can present our husband and wife without a spot or wrinkle in perfect splendor, Lord. And in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.